You know, when we think about holiness, we usually think it's something on the inside, right? A feeling. But what if it was a detailed, external code you had to live by every single day? Today, we're stepping into that world. We're diving into Leviticus 21, the sacred rulebook for ancient Israel's priests, where every single action, from grieving to grooming, was meticulously laid out.
All right, picture this. You get a job offer, but the employee handbook, it doesn't just cover your 9 to 5. It tells you how to grieve, who you're allowed to marry, and even what physical condition you have to be in. That's exactly the world we're about to enter as we explore what might just be the most demanding job description ever written.
So where does this code even begin? Well, it starts by drawing this really powerful line in the sand, separating the priests from one of the most universal human experiences there is, death. This is all about establishing their primary role as servants of a living God.
Okay, verse 1. Right out of the gate, we get the foundational rule. Now, in that culture, death was seen as a source of, let's call it ritual impurity. It's something that separates you from God's presence. So the priests, they were forbidden from contact with the dead. Imagine that. As servants of a living God, they had to embody life itself, keeping a sacred distance from death to stay pure for their service. But, and this is so important, God immediately gives some really critical exceptions. Verse 2 starts the list of who was considered his near of kin, his mother and his father, his son and his daughter and his brother. Think of it like the absolute inner circle, the direct lines on a family tree. Then, verse 3 adds one more person, his virgin sister who lives with him and has no husband. For these specific people, and only these, a compassionate exception is made. He is allowed to mourn.
And then verse 4 just locks it all in. It really hammers home his role as a leader. For anyone outside that tiny immediate family, we're talking aunts, uncles, cousins, the priest had to stay separate. And listen, this wasn't about being heartless. It was all about protecting his sacred status, preventing him from profaning or making common his holy office among the people.
Okay, so that separation from death, that was just the beginning. The code now takes that idea of holiness and applies it, well, everywhere else, to the priest's physical body and even his family. He didn't just have to be holy, he had to look holy, and his entire household was a reflection of that sacred duty. Verse 5 gets super specific about grooming. You might be asking, why these rules? Well, it turns out that shaving your head a certain way, or trimming the edges of your beard, or even cutting your body, those were all common things that neighboring pagan cultures did to honor their gods or their dead. So this created a clear visual identity. I mean, picture it. Every time you saw a priest, his uncut hair and beard were like a walking billboard that screamed, "We are set apart. Our God is different." And verse 6 gives us the why behind all of this. This wasn't some ancient fashion trend. It was about their function. They were the ones who presented the bread of God, those sacred offerings. So because they handled holy things, they had to be holy themselves, inside and out. Their very bodies were instruments of worship. From the body, we move to the home. Verse 7 makes it crystal clear that a priest's holiness had to include his marriage. This was not a private decision, it was a very public statement. By forbidding marriage to women who were prostitutes, divorced, or defiled, the law made sure the priestly family line started with a foundation of perceived ritual purity, protecting the sacred reputation of the entire household. Then verse 9 hits us with one of the most, well, frankly, jarring commands in the whole chapter. The honor of the priesthood was so absolute that if a priest's daughter became a prostitute, she wasn't just profaning herself, but her father's sacred office. The consequence was terrifyingly severe. It's a really stark reminder of the immense, almost crushing weight of honor placed on a priestly family.
So you're probably thinking these rules are incredibly strict, right? Well, believe it or not, there was one man who was held to an even higher, almost impossibly perfect standard, the high priest. And this just lays it out so clearly. A regular priest, he could mourn his immediate family. The high priest? Nope, he couldn't mourn for anyone, not even his own mom and dad. Verse 10 goes into the details of this higher standard. Things like uncovering your head or tearing your clothes, those were universal signs of deep grief back then. But the high priest was forbidden from doing any of it. Why? Because he had to be a living symbol of God's unshakable presence among the people. His personal sorrow could never be allowed to visually overshadow his sacred, constant duty. And verse 11 just makes that personal cost painfully clear. Can you imagine the sacrifice? The high priest is standing outside the home where his own parents are being mourned, and he can't go in. He can't touch them one last time. His duty to God came before even the most fundamental family bond. The key point in verse 12 is that his life was literally tied to the holy place. That anointing oil on him was a permanent mark of his consecration. It's almost like he existed inside a shimmering bubble around the sanctuary that he just could not cross for personal reasons, in case he might profane that holy space. This idea of ultimate purity carries right over into his marriage in verse 13. The high priest had exactly one option. He had to marry a virgin from his own people. This was to make sure his family line, the holiest in the entire nation, started from a place of complete ritual purity, untouched by any prior union. Verse 14 then spells out all the exclusions. A regular priest already had a lot of restrictions, but the high priest's list was even longer. It even excluded widows, really doubling down on the idea that his partner had to be completely untouched by any previous union or worldly stain. And finally, verse 15 gives us the divine signature on all these rules. Why this incredibly high standard? Because his holiness wasn't something he achieved on his own. His entire life, his grief, his marriage, had to be perfect because he was personally set apart by God himself, who declares, "For I, the Lord, sanctify him." So we've covered conduct and family. Now the code, starting in verse 16, turns to the physical body itself. Just like the animal sacrifices had to be perfect without any blemish, the same standard applied to the men who offered them. Verse 17 delivers this really difficult message to Aaron. The idea was simple. The offering to God should be perfect, so the person presenting it needed to reflect that same physical wholeness. And that meant that not all of Aaron's sons would be eligible to serve in the most sacred roles. Verses 18 through 21 then give us the specific list of physical blemishes that would keep a priest from approaching the altar. And it's a long, detailed list, you know? It covers everything from blindness and broken bones to skin diseases. The core idea was that the priest was representing the people before a perfect God, and that representation needed to be physically complete. But, and this is a really crucial distinction in verses 22 and 23, a priest with a blemish wasn't just kicked out. He could still eat the holy food, his share. You can almost picture him sharing a meal with his priestly family, totally part of the community, but then having to stand back respectfully as the others approach the sacred altar. He was still a priest, just with a more limited role. And the chapter wraps up in verse 24 with the law being delivered. Moses, who's that bridge between God and the people, relays this whole demanding code to Aaron and his sons. The divine standard for the priesthood, it's now public. The rules are set. So all of this brings us to one last thought. This whole chapter is about external rules, right? Rules about mourning, marriage, even physical bodies. But they're all pointing to something deeper, an internal idea of holiness. It really makes you wonder, if the focus back then was on outward perfection to get close to God, what does true holiness look like for us now?